on a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, watch that sound. Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to my show, The Robust Opposition. I am very pleased to present my special guest for tonight, Howie Hawkins. And Howie Hawkins is the leading Green Party candidate for president. How you doing, Howie?
I'm doing great.
So we're talking in a very strange time, an event of the century, the coronavirus pandemic. How are you holding up? Are you social distancing? Is that difficult for you? Are any of your friends ill with the virus? Tell me about what's going on.
Well, I'm doing fine. I'm kind of an introvert, so my idea of an exciting night is to sit at home and read a book. So I'm finding plenty to do. And I am social distancing, but I have friends who have anxiety and depression. I've had some calls from people. I do know some people that do have the virus down in New York City. Nobody here in Syracuse that I'm aware of yet. And the numbers don't look good. And it looks like the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. So I think this is just beginning. And because if things go well, we'll have a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. But this is a coronavirus. That's a common cold virus, other versions of the coronavirus. We haven't had a vaccine for any of those. There are 4 major viruses, as I understand it. So this is very serious. And not only is it, I know a lot of people that have lost their jobs.
Yeah.
That is, I think, distressing people as much as the fear of getting the disease. Is day to day. And then watching what's going on in Washington is, that wakes me up in the morning, gets my blood going, because, the president is totally incompetent. He should just resign, get out of the way. Washington needs to take action, and they're not. And Trump gets up there and talks about himself more than he does about the crisis. And so it's left to governors and local governments to do the best they can, but we're short of supplies.
So I watch the press conferences every day of my mayor and my governor. And yes, I even watch Trump, as hard as it is to watch him, because you're exactly right. Everything he says, everything he's ever said has been in relation to himself and how it makes him look. There was an editorial in the Washington Post calling for the news media to stop covering his press conferences. And others have said that Pence should take over. God knows when we're asking for Pence to take over, things have got to be pretty bad. But let me ask you this, because I listened to you on a SoundCloud. You talked about what you would do for the coronavirus, and he's actually taken some of your recommendations, like he invoked the Defense Protection Act. And in today's press conference that I watched, he talked about how 3M is in the process of making masks. And yesterday, Governor Gavin Newsom talked about how Tesla is in the process of making ventilators. The National Guard has been deployed, as you called for. So do you think that good things are going to happen despite the president? And my second question is, how do you think Cuomo's been doing? Because I'm not a big fan of Cuomo. I protested him over fracking when he came out here for a fundraiser. But I've been watching him, and I think he's been doing a pretty good job.
Well, Cuomo has stepped up to reassure the public and mobilize what resources he can. Trump may have signed the Defense Production Act, but he's not using it. We're in a situation like World War II, where we formed the Office of War Mobilization, and the federal government either built or took over a quarter of manufacturing capacity in order to turn industry on a dime into what they call the arsenal of democracy, which armed the US, the UK, Russia, and all the allies. And he's not doing that. I mean, the least that thing could do would be to get an inventory. And then how much do we need to produce and by what time and to get it where? I don't see that planning going on. He's signed the bill, but then he's talking to the companies one-on-one. And it needs a much more coordinated, comprehensive approach. And then we need to see what the plan is so we can, do our local planning. When are we going to get the ventilators? When are we going to get the extra hospital beds, the respirators, and all the other things we're short of?
Now, I wasn't around in World War II, and I don't think you were either. But I have a suspicion that these companies are going to probably be gouging these various levels of government to produce these things because corporations have gotten so greedy over the decades. They used to have different stakeholders. In other words, they were responsible to their workers and to the communities that they operated in. Now they just seem like they're responsible to their shareholders, and some of them even not that, just their CEOs and the excessive salaries they make.
Well, during World War II, basically the government told the big shareholders on the board, take a vacation. And they brought on the engineers and the managers that knew how to coordinate things and design things and the workforces. And the government took over the top management of these things. And the problem is at the end of World War II, the government had built a lot of manufacturing facilities and they sold them back to the companies for pennies on the dollar. It was a big subsidy. I would argue that if we build things at the federal level, and this gets to my Green New Deal, I want to do it in manufacturing, the rail systems, and energy production. In the manufacturing, the factories we build should be leased to worker co-ops, so they get the full value of their labor, and the government gets its share for building it in the lease. And we just don't turn it over to big businesses that, as you say, are more exploitative than they've ever been. The ratio of CEO pay to the average worker coming out of World War II was 8-1. Today, in the Fortune 500 companies, it's 300-1 on average. It's just off the charts.
Yeah.
And you can't let them use whatever government action is taken to profit. This is an emergency. The idea is to help the people,
Right.
not the profits of big companies.
Well,
Who just got a huge $1.5 trillion tax break that they spent on, buying back their own stocks. Like the airline industry is asking for $58 billion. They just spent $38 billion buying back their own stocks.
Yeah.
From that tax cut.
Yeah.
And Trump is just a damn idiot. He says, "Oh, now because we gave them that money, we got a cushion." No, we got $1.5 trillion less money in the federal budget. We got a bigger debt.
Modern monetary theorists don't really worry about the debt or the deficit, and I think they have a good point there. I don't think the taxpayers pay for these things. I think it's just a computer entry, and I'm going to try to have Stephanie Kelton on my show to talk about this. But here's the deal. Here's the deal, fat. I sound like Joe Biden. Look, fat, here's the deal. Trump's popularity is growing. I was shocked to see this yesterday. Since the coronavirus has started, he's actually improved his favorability ratings. What do you make of that? Do you think the American people are just ignorant, or do you think they just care about style, like he's authoritative and he looks like he's doing something?
I think most people are seeing little clips of him on TV and they're saying, "Oh, he's paying attention, he's taking charge." They're not listening through the whole press conference and seeing what he's saying. And I think the bump is going to be temporary because the economy is going to drop faster than we've ever seen. The whole service sector is shut down. Retail is shut down. People are unemployed. I mean, the dominoes are going to just keep knocking each other over. And he's going to pay a price for that. Plus, people's savings, if they had 401ks or pension funds with their employer, they're in trouble now. And people are going to begin to feel that. And, they're going to put the responsibility on Trump. So I think that explains the bump, but I don't think it's going to last.
Yeah. Now, what do you think about all these Republicans sounding like socialists? I mean, they're about ready to approve a $1.6 trillion package. Bernie says it should be a $2 trillion package. And they are ready to sign this. And nobody is saying, how are we going to pay for this? Isn't it funny how that works?
Yeah, well, an election's coming up, and they're scared to death that they're going to get blamed because they have the power in the Senate, McConnell, who has used his power, and they got Trump. And so they're like ready to throw money at the economy. The problem is the bill that just got rejected in the Senate tonight was really written by lobbyists for big business. And the first thing we got to do is take care of the working people. They need cash to pay rent. You know, we need to start giving everybody, you know, Bernie Sanders called for 2,000 along with about half a dozen other senators, 2,000 a person. That would be good every month until this crisis is over. That would enable people to, you know, buy the necessities. I think, and this is an idea I saw come from those two economists that have worked on the wealth tax, Zuckman and Sayers, that we should have social insurance for small business. In other words, the government should top off the pay. You know, unemployment insurance in a lot of countries cover part of your pay, but it doesn't cover everybody. So you make sure the workers are paid and the businesses can pay their rent, utilities, their debt service. So when we get to the other end of this, they can go right back into business. Because if they all go bankrupt and, you know, sell their assets and, you know, lose their workers, it's going to be starting new businesses all over, and it's just going to slow the recovery and make the misery last longer. So I think we need a program like that. Right now, what they're proposing is lending money to small businesses as if they're making money they can pay it back with.
Right.
They're on hold right now.
Yeah.
There's so much the federal government needs to do, but the first thing they need to do is take care of the regular people. And then we can get to the big businesses that, you know, we want to keep an airline industry, but I think you need real conditions on the money they need. I haven't actually looked at why they need what they need. I know they got leases on their planes and, you know, things to maintain, but I don't know why it's $58 billion.
They got payroll, of course, and Sarah Nelson, who's the president of the Flight Attendants Union, really wants this bailout, but she wants to make sure that it goes to payroll and, you know, not, and even Trump has said no stock buybacks. Everybody seems to be in agreement with that, except for maybe the Democrats. Anyway, I want to talk more about policy later, but I want to go back to the beginning. When I have people on my shows under normal circumstances, I always want to start with your background, how you became a political activist, your education, what you've been employed in, that sort of thing.
When I was headed for kindergarten, I have a set of cousins who are, their mother was one of the first Japanese war brides. And they're Army brats, and they're stationed in Virginia. And I happen to have another set of white cousins in Virginia. And when they're getting ready to go to school, as I am, the Japanese kids are being told they're going to the colored schools, and the white kids are going to the white schools. And I'm, you know, 5 years old, and I know that's wrong. And I'm wondering why the adults let that happen. You know, what's wrong with them? Who's in charge? And then I get in elementary school, and they're saying, if there's a nuclear war, dive under your desk and put your, you know, hands over your head. And I'm thinking, I know enough about nuclear weapons. This is not going to save us. So I was pretty skeptical as, you know, the adults really being in charge. And then I'm 12 years old and I'm in California, and Ronald Reagan is leading the charge for the Republican Party to repeal the just passed Rumford Fair Housing law in a citizen initiative referendum. And by the end of the year, they repealed that law. And I was brought up in a Republican family, Midwestern Republicans, who taught me that Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. We're for civil rights. We don't want to get into stupid foreign wars. Watch the public money, and otherwise leave us the hell alone. That's basically what I thought Republicanism was. And here they were failing on the civil rights test. So I'm looking at the Democrats, and they had a choice between the segregated Dixiecrats of Mississippi or the Mississippi Freedom Democrats, an integrated slate. And Johnson sent liberals like Humphrey and Mondale and Joseph Rao to tell the Freedom Democrats they were going to have to wait. And they'd get 2 token seats, who, you know, delegates who wouldn't vote, but they could walk around the floor and talk to people, which they rejected. So I'm asking at 12 years old, where's my party? And I later learned John Lewis asked that question in his speech to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom the year before, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So I kind of got caught up in the movement at a young age. And Johnson won that election and escalated in Vietnam. So we had an anti-war movement as well as the civil rights movement. And in the Bay Area, I think we were on the cutting edge of the ecology movement. I was swept up into all of that. So my first party was Peace and Freedom in 1968, and the People's Party, 72, 76, that was Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor who was an anti-war and supported draft resistance and so forth. And then we ran the Citizens Party in 1980, Barry Commoner, the foremost environmental scientist of the time. And then in 1984, I was invited, well, I was sent by the Clamshell Alliance, which was invited to send a couple of people to a meeting to organize a Green Party in this country.
I want to talk about the Clamshell Alliance and the anti-apartheid movement, because I was reading in your background that you were a co-founder of the Clamshell Alliance, and I was peripherally involved with that as a student in college in the late 70s, because they organized the occupation of the Seabrook nuclear power plant up in Seabrook, New Hampshire. I was also on the editorial board of the alternative newspaper at my college, which was Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And we made decisions by consensus, just like the Clamshell Alliance did. And I remember we used to have meetings all night trying to come to consensus. And that was also the period of time when we were using our leverage to try to get our college to divest from companies that did business with South Africa. So you want to talk about your involvement with those two movements before we get on to the Green Party?
My draft number had come up and I enlisted in the Marines. It was the year they got rid of the student deferments. And I spent a summer training, officer training at Quantico. And then the college, I was going to Dartmouth, said, get the GI Bill before we give you scholarship and loans going forward. But I had to graduate to get the lieutenant commission. So I told the Marines, you got to send me to Parris Island or Camp Pendleton. I'll just be an enlisted guy. They said they'll get back to me. And over my 6-year enlistment period, they never did. So I'm in limbo. So I spent a lot of time. We had a People's Energy Project in New Hampshire. And, you know, we went to public hearings. We picketed at the Amscake Bank and the Public Service Company in New Hampshire. And it wasn't working. So the last resort, we called it, direct action, big occupation at Seabrook. So in 76, we sent 20 Seacoast people, and then later in the year, 200 New Hampshire people. And then in the spring of 1977, the goal was 2,000. We ended with 1,414 arrested. I don't know if you were one of them, but that was spring 1977. And so that's how I got involved in the Clamshell Alliance. That was in New Hampshire, we then reached out to people in, all of New England. And it was one of those organizing things. You organize a lot of events, and every once in a while you hit the bullseye or the jackpot. And everybody came to that, and the movement spread across the whole country. And the anti-apartheid, after the Soweto uprising in 1976, I formed with other college students, including students at Wesleyan, the Northeast Coalition for the Liberation of Southern Africa. And we pushed for divestment. And we did for 76 to 85. And we made little progress, but then in 85, the shanties, and we started one at Dartmouth. By then I was a carpenter, and we prefabricated ours, brought it in a flatbed truck, dropped it on the green before they could stop us. And it caught fire and went across the country. And then they started the Trans-Africa, did the protests outside the White House. So a bill that Ron Dellums and Charles Diggs and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus had there for sanctions against South Africa finally got passed. Reagan vetoed it, but Congress overrode it in the fall of 86. So in a year, we went from being on the margins with that movement to winning. And, those kinds of things is what gives me hope, even in, difficult times like now. So that's what I was doing in the 70s and 80s, besides also thinking, we need our own party. Because when we go fight on these issues, who are we fighting against? It's usually the Democrats in the cities. It's Republicans in the rural areas, but, that's who we're fighting.
Okay, so tell me about those early days when you were founding the Green Party. I mean, I remember the Green Party in Germany, and I knew what its goal was, but you founded it here in this country, and you ran for office many times. You ran for governor 3 times in New York, and you run for lesser, local offices. What were you thinking in those early days, and how do you feel, 30 years later, or actually almost 40 years later, to see that it hasn't really gone as far as you probably had hoped it would?
Well, when we first met there in St. Paul, Minnesota, August 1984, the thing I tried to impress upon people, based on my experience with Peace and Freedom, the People's and the Citizens Party, was you cannot build a party with a real base out of a presidential campaign. We should not run anybody for high office. We should build local groups and get into the electoral politics at the local level and build a base. And we proceeded to do that for the next dozen years. And we had something like 300 local groups around the country. By 1976, when Ralph Nader agreed to let us use his name on state ballots, because by that point, some of the states are ready to, get into state politics. And we got Ralph on over 30 states, which I think convinced him that we should be the vehicle for his 2000 campaign, which was a real campaign. 96, he just stood for office and spent less than $5,000, so he didn't have to report to the Federal Election Commission. And so I think the good news is that there were a lot of efforts at third parties over these years, or efforts, going into the Democratic Party, similar to what Sanders' campaigns have been with Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition. And there was an effort at a Women's Party, a party coming out of the Rainbow Coalition that Ron Dellums, who was Jesse's campaign manager and executive director of the Rainbow Coalition, tried to run in 92. There was a Labor Party effort. I was part of that. I didn't know, which party would, get the upper hand or be the center for how these could come together. And that failed, it withered away. There was a new party, but they became the Working Families Party and really part of the Democratic Party. So the good news is the Green Party's still here. And I think that's because we have a grassroots base. I also think it's because, most of our people are pissed off former Democrats. They're Democrats, they're progressive, and then the Democrats support the war in Iraq. Or they, like Jill Stein, our presidential campaign in 2012 and 2016, the last straw for her was they passed by referendum public campaign finance in Massachusetts, and the Democrats who controlled the legislature wouldn't fund it. And whether it's police brutality or affordable housing, the real estate industry runs Democratic politics in the cities. The Democrats are on the other side. You go to Pennsylvania, and even the Sanders supporting elected officials won't touch the fracking issue in Pennsylvania. It's only the Greens that will. And the Democrats are as much opposed to us, or most of them, as the Republicans. So anyway, that's why I think the Greens keep getting replenished. I think we could have done a lot better job organizing. I think the Greens tend to be activists. They'll show up at demonstrations, at public hearings, but they don't have the skills that a union organizer or a community organizer has to go into communities that are not involved. The Greens would go in there with a leaflet and say, join us. An organizer goes in and says, what's going on? How can I help? And listens and builds relationships and trust. And then you can talk about the difficult political questions later. So I think, that's an area we can improve in. And I said we can't build a party out of a presidential race, and here I am running for president. But one of my goals, central goal really, is we need ballot lines, and the presidential race affects about 40 of the 50 states' ballot lines. And with ballot lines, we can more easily run local candidates. And, there are about 150 Greens elected right now holding political office around the country, which is really more than any third party on the left since the Socialist Party, before World War II. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we need, but it's not nothing.
Let me ask you this. So you ran for governor 3 times against Cuomo, a couple of those times. You got between 1.3 and 4.8% of the vote. Do you think it's obstacles that are put in place by the Democratic and Republican parties that hurt you the most? Or do you think it's the fact that we don't have a parliamentary system in this country? And would you be in favor of rewriting our Constitution the way Iceland did, for example, and going to a parliamentary system?
Well, I do like a parliamentary system because it makes the executive accountable to the elected legislature. We have an imperial presidency, it's monarchical. And but that's a big change. I think more immediately we need a ranked choice national popular vote for president. That will end the spoiler, lesser evil problem, and will also assure that the president's elected by a majority of the voters. We need to push for proportional representation in Congress. That would be a real game changer. So those barriers built into our plurality winner or single plurality winner system are an obstacle to third parties because they force people to vote for the lesser evil to stop the greater evil rather than for what they might really want. But I think equally responsible for that is the fact that the left in this country for almost 100 years now, since the mid-30s, has gone into the Democratic Party, and it's no longer, it doesn't have its own identity, its own voice, its own program. And, you know, socialists and progressives go into the Democratic Party and they end up working for corporate liberals at best and neoliberals more often because they're lesser evil to the Republicans. So the left disappears and lefties are doing the grunt work, knocking on the doors, making the phone calls for people that are really on the other side of the issues.
Well,
And so I think it's as much the subjective side. The left needs to get back to the old socialist principle of working class political independence. We can't trust, you know, the upper middle class professionals and the capitalists to speak for our interests. And we need to speak for ourselves. And there are more of us than there are of them. We just need to get organized. So I think that is the more important thing. That's the thing we can do the most about. And then as we get organized, we can start changing those structures that distort our democratic process.
Well, you know, the problem is that the left is so democratic with a small d, and the right is much more authoritarian. Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of research about that, sort of like the psychology of leftists versus rightists. The socialists are always fighting each other. I mean, I have people arguing with me about Syria. You know, there's Ashley Smith in Vermont has one idea about Assad, and then you've got other socialists, there's the New Worldwide Socialist Web, whatever it is, with a different view. And I just get so confused, like even the socialists can't get it together. And if, you know, then you have the communists. I've developed a lot more respect for the Revolutionary Communist Party, even though I used to think Bob Avakian was like a cult, because I've been very impressed with the people from Refuse Fascism and the danger that they see in Trump. And the fact that every time he comes here, they're the ones that are coming out into the streets and saying, this cannot stand. You know, the other progressives are too busy organizing for Bernie when I think they rightly see that we could have a fascist takeover in this country. He could declare martial law and cancel the election. What do you think of that?
The left needs to learn how to agree to disagree on some issues. You know, on Syria, everybody on the left says the US should not intervene militarily. Their assessment of Assad differs. Their assessment of Iranian and Russian intervention differs. But we can't agree on US out of Syria. So let's agree on that and we can debate the other things. And you mentioned consensus earlier. There's a place for consensus, you know, in small groups, affinity groups, making tactical decisions in a direct action. You know, in a small group in a meeting, or it has its place. But when you get large groups, sometimes you got to say, we're going to have a fair debate and then take a vote. And what we need to do is let the majority position be the organization's position, but allow minorities to continue to raise their perspectives. So what we need, Staunton Lind, who was a labor historian and lawyer, once wrote a book with Gar Perovitz about the New American Socialism Program and Strategy, I think was the title. And Staunton Lind said in there, what we need is a socialist party, a mass party that doesn't kick out the wobblies, which is what happened in 1912. They had a fight over tactics, elections versus direct action at the workplace. So the right wing pushed out the wobblies. We need a mass socialist party that, you know, can tolerate different points of view and agree, you know, come together around the big things that we all agree on. And so, you know, I think Robert's Rules was actually a revolutionary document. It sort of compiled all the, you know, civic organizations and town meetings in New England and got the rules, the best rules. And so, you know, for example, in consensus, people are new to it, say, well, they have this rule that nobody can speak twice before somebody speaks first. That's great. Well, that's been in Robert's Rules for over a century. So, you know, there's a lot of things there that I think we threw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think, you know, if we have a mass party, it's going to be multi-tendency. We're going to have differences of opinion, but we got to find a way to have a fair debate, take a position, and move on the things we agree on.
Okay, so you wrote a book that's coming out called The Case for an Independent Left Party, which is based on an article that you wrote. Make the case, the major points, and then talk about how that would be different from this People's Party that Nick Brania has been working on for 3 years, Movement for a People's Party. At first, he wanted to draft Bernie to head it, but it soon became clear that he wasn't going to do it. And then there's also the Workers' Party that a lot of labor unions have been talking about for decades.
Well, it is a working class based party. I say it's for the working class, which needs its own party, and everyone who loves peace, justice, freedom, and the environment. And the way we build that is from below. I mean, we really need grassroots locals where people actually meet face to face and don't just deal with business. Form an executive committee, let them do the administrative tasks. Have education, have discussion, make decisions about activities. The problem we have today is everybody goes online to see what Move On wants them to do next, or whatever their favorite silo is. And you look behind that, and there's, some rich liberals, the Peter Lewis's and the George Soros's and so forth fund those groups, just like the Koch brothers and the Mercers fund the right-wing nonprofits. And that's partly why I think we get confused, or we don't have good discussions on issues like Syria, because everybody's getting their information from their silo and they're throwing insults at each other. But people at the grassroots, once we get to know each other and trust each other, we can have honest conversations. And I think that'll make us smarter. We got to be really smart. We're trying to beat the oldest party in the world, the second most enthusiastic capitalist party in the world, that's the Democratic Party, and the richest party in the world, the most enthusiastic capitalist party, the Republicans. We can't do that, just having slogans and periodic actions thrown at us from these nonprofits. We got to have a strategy. How do we take power in our metro region? Is that the inner city and the inner ring suburbs on a class basis being the majority as opposed to exurbs where, the more affluent people live? Is that the strategy, or what is it? One of the things the SNCC did with their Freedom Summer, which produced the Freedom Democratic Party, they also had freedom schools. And they were teaching people basic literacy and numeracy. And then they taught them Black history. And then they taught them power structure analysis.
Yeah.
Who runs the county? What's the sheriff? What's going on in the courthouse? What are these plantation owners? How do they buy influence? And so people knew what they're up against. I've talked to people go around and they don't know who, I'm talking about green locals as I'm campaigning. They don't have a local press list. They don't know who the big donors are to the Democratic candidates. Who the real estate players are, because that's always the big thing in local politics. They don't have a power structure analysis. So these are the kinds of things we need to develop a grassroots movement where people are actually developing themselves as speakers, writers, thinkers. So we're smart when we take on the power structure. And so then how do you build a party? I think we just got to start organizing our local areas and build these kind of formations and then come together, federate at a larger level. And the Green Party has ballot lines, it can play a role. Nick Brana's got an email list. I haven't seen him organized, so that, that Movement for a People's Party. There's a lot of stuff online. People say I'm forming a party, but you need people, and the people need to be engaged. So I think it's an organizing task, not just mobilizing.
Well, exactly. I mean, Jane McAlevey wrote that great book, which I'm sure you read, No Shortcuts. And I heard her speak with Alex Caputo Pearl, who is the leader of the Los Angeles Teachers Union recently. And she talked about exactly what you're saying. Mobilizing is not organizing, and you have to have these face-to-face conversations with people. Also, I agree with what you say about the nonprofit industrial complex, but certain of them, like I will tell you, I'm very involved with Food and Water Watch. They do power mapping all the time. They work with the Sunrise Movement. Some of these Sunrise kids are very sophisticated. The same thing with DSA. I know that they're working within the Democratic Party. You don't like that, but we are working on local issues, and that's where I've been able to see the most effective change happen. We've had a lot of successes in 2019. Talking about your candidacy and your platform now, because you are running, you are an alternative. A lot of people are very pissed off the way the Democratic establishment has sabotage Bernie Sanders for a second time in a row. I mean, between this consolidation after South Carolina around Joe Biden, who's probably the weakest candidate of all the centrists, and he's been missing in action for the last week. People on Twitter are like putting together these memes, where's Joe Biden? You know, he tweets out something like, I'm trying to figure out how to do a live stream from my house, you know, which is BS because he did a live stream. He's done 2 live streams from his house. So I don't know what's holding him back. But meanwhile, Bernie Sanders done about 5 of them this week. He just did one with AOC, with Rashida Tlaib, with Ilhan Omar, and a musical guest, and him. So he had 5 different locations. He's probably using Zoom, which is what we're using right here. And Joe Biden can't figure that out. People are saying, if this happens again, we're leaving the Democratic Party. You know, I did it in 2017. You know that expression, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. Cheat Bernie once, shame on me, cheat him twice, you know, I won't get fooled again. So I exited, but we got a lot more people that are ready to do it. So it's if you want to make your case to the Bernie people, let's talk about the fact that you were the first one to run on the Green New Deal in 2010. So how does your Green New Deal differ from Bernie Sanders? It's very significantly different.
The first thing is we're on a faster timeline. Bernie gets to 0 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. He gets to 0 in the transportation and the energy production sector by 2030. And he's an order of magnitude ahead of any of the other Democrats who have talked about a Green New Deal. I'll give him that. They were talking about spending, you know, 2 or 3 trillion over 10 years. He's 16.3 trillion. My Green New Deal says we got to get to 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And so we priced out a Green New Deal budget that comes to 27.5 trillion over 10 years. And I think the other big difference is he wants to socialize energy production through Federal Energy Administration, TVA, Bonneville, those kind of institutions that already exist. And we want to do that as well, but also take over the oil and gas companies and use whatever revenues we get from fossil fuel sales during the transition for renewables, because those companies, the Koch brothers and Exxon, are going to reinvest it in oil and gas. And then we also want to take over the rails. We need to electrify freight rails, densify that network, move a lot of the freight from trucking to rails. We need high-speed bullet trains between the cities. We need to rebuild the trolley system that we had all over the country from the 1890s till the 1930s. And that needs to be done at the national level. And then manufacturing. If we're going to build the rail and the zero-emission vehicles and the solar collectors and the wind generators, right now, a lot of that we have to get from Germany and China. We need to rebuild our manufacturing. And so we call for really rebuilding the whole manufacturing sector with clean technologies. So instead of coke ovens, we have electric arc furnaces for steel. We use the new technologies coming on for cement that don't emit carbon. You know, you put calcium carbonate in cement, the calcium hardens the cement, but the carbon goes into the atmosphere. That's about 5% of the world's carbon footprint. We got to change that technology. We need to go from petrochemical plastics that don't degrade in the environment to biodegradable bioplastics that are made with agricultural feedstocks, you know, carbohydrates instead of hydrocarbons. You can go through all the technologies. We need to rebuild manufacturing so it's zero waste and powered by clean energy. And that can only be done through the public sector. Like I said, with respect to the coronavirus pandemic and crisis, we need to do what we did during World War II. When the Office of War Mobilization took over a quarter manufacturing, now we need an Office of Climate Mobilization to do the same thing. So I think the big difference between Bernie's program, which is really much, like I said, it's an order of magnitude better than anything else out there from the Democrats. What we need to do is run a lot more of this through the public sector and, you know, have a Office of Climate Mobilization to coordinate this public planning.
So let's talk about healthcare. You want to have Medicare for all at first. That's the first part of your plan, but then you go even further. Talk about your plan and what it's based on. Ron Dellum's and Barbara Lee's bill, which is further developed for you by Margaret Flowers, who's been on my show. She's on the board of Physicians for a National Health Program.
Well, back in the 1970s, we had three plans to debate. We had the Nixon plan, which is what became Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, involving mandates with employers and individuals. And then we had national health insurance, which is what the Kennedy bill was. That's what we call Medicare for All today, the Sanders bill and the J. Paul bill in the House. And that's insurance. So it's public insurance pays, but it's mostly privately delivered. And then there was the National Health Service model, like they have in the UK or in Italy or in Cuba or in Costa Rica. And that's where the payment is public, but also the delivery is public. So you have public hospitals and clinics, and doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers are public servants on salaries. And so the Dellum's bill, which grew out of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which was the civil rights group that, patched people up after they got beat up in these demonstrations, they said this needs to be democratic. So we'll have local elected health boards that govern the system locally, make sure the healthcare resources are distributed to all neighborhoods and are rationally distributed, so we don't have too many MRIs, but not enough ventilators. And those federate to the state and national level to govern the whole system. And because people are on salary, not being paid fee for service, you can control costs better, because then the idea is you get a global budget for a hospital or a clinic, and then you deliver services with that budget, and doctors can take the time they need. They don't have to order extra tests. You socialize the malpractice insurance, so that doesn't raise costs. And it's just a much more rational system. It's more democratic, better cost control. So our plan would immediately go to the national health insurance model, Medicare for all, and over 10 years build out this national health service.
Yes, well, that's excellent, because we can see what's happening with the hospitals right now. They're taking over everything. You can't even have an independent family doctor with his own practice anymore. And the pharmaceutical companies are making everything in China.
I left one part out. We want to turn the big pharma into public utilities, public enterprises. 15 of the 18 largest pharmaceutical companies don't even do research and development of vaccines, antivirals, and antibiotics. And we're facing these drug-resistant antibiotics.
We do the research, and then we give them the chance to build them out, and they get all the money for it. That is just crazy. It's like Stockholm syndrome on the part of the government or something.
And they're using their monopoly position to gouge us. So we're paying 10 times more than they are in Canada for basic drugs. So yeah, they have, their record shows we can't trust them to provide the medicines we need. So they should be part of this National Health Service.
Now let's talk about your economic Bill of Rights. You've already talked about some industries that you would nationalize in your Green New Deal program. And what else was I going to mention? Oh, and healthcare. Now in Bernie's Green New Deal, he calls for public broadband, public power, public housing, but that's about it. As far as, he's not saying that we're going to nationalize all those industries, but great big expansion of publicly funded public goods. What other industries would you nationalize, and what is your economic Bill of Rights?
Well, in terms of industries, we want to build we call it interstate, same as federal or nationalized interstate broadband system, interstate grid, interstate railroad system. Manufacturing, important sectors of it would be in the public sector. Banking. I think we need to look at these network platforms like Amazon, Google, Facebook, which the nature of those platforms is that the more people, as soon as one of those platforms gets the most people, everybody wants to be there because the most information, the most people are there, and they become a monopoly. And one of the classic forms of enterprise that should be public are natural monopolies. So I think we need to look at that. And we should also have a program to encourage worker cooperatives, retiring owners, sell it to your workers. We should have technical assistance and financing for that, for startups. So that's socialism in the private sector, cooperatives. And in that case, workers will not be exploited. They get the full fruit of their labor. Or in a consumer cooperative, you pay the cost, not a cost plus profit. So I think we need to encourage those kinds of things to have a more socialized economy. And I think if we do that, a lot of people are saying, well, I want to work for myself. I got an idea I want to bring to market. I'm a farmer. I don't want nobody telling me how to grow my corn and put in my hay. Well, I believe that if we provide these public enterprises, and I'll get to the Economic Bill of Rights, these public guarantees for security, those public avenues are going to be the public avenues of private commerce, so that people can go out and take a risk on a new idea, or start a restaurant and see how it goes, knowing they can fall back on these public guarantees and public utilities. So the Economic Bill of Rights, Bernie keeps saying it came from Franklin Roosevelt, who called on Congress to enact it in his 1944 and 1945 State of the Union addresses. The Civil Rights Movement picked it up with the March on Washington in '63, the Freedom Budget, which they tried to get Congress to enact, and then the Poor People's Campaign from King. And we need to pick it up again. So what the 6 rights I'm talking about, and Bernie's got one too, and the one he doesn't include is a guaranteed income above poverty, which is one of the demands that they put in there when the Civil Rights Movement brought these issues forward. So you have a job guarantee. Basically, Progress Works Administration with enough public jobs to employ everybody. So instead of going to the unemployment office, you'd go to the employment office. And there would be public services and public works, mostly designed locally and mostly federally funded. And so nobody who wanted to work, was able to work, would not be able to work. And they would pay a living wage and benefits. A guaranteed income above poverty, build that into the income tax. So if your income is below the poverty line, which needs to be raised, that's a whole nother discussion, but below a reasonable poverty line, then the government sends you a check every month until your income comes above poverty. Affordable housing. We need universal rent control right now. That's another thing we did during World War II. There's not enough affordable housing being built because the private market wants to cater to the upscale market where they can make more money. We have 7.8 million very low income people who cannot find affordable housing. We have 500,000 people who are homeless. So my plan, Bernie's got a plan with AOC to build a lot of public housing. I forget the number. I think it was about 2.5 million over 10 years, 2.5 million units. I'm calling for 25 million units over 10 years. It's a $2.5 trillion program. And the public housing program is not just affordable housing, it's clean energy, it's a jobs program, and it's a desegregation program, because we want to make public housing available to everybody like they do in Europe. Professionals, blue collar, the single mom with no income and some kids living in the same developments. And that's a way we can also begin to build walkable communities and break down this sprawl by putting large units next to transportation hubs and shopping areas. And so it's a big program, but I think it'll solve the housing problem and some other problems. So that's jobs, income, housing, healthcare. We just talked about that. National health insurance, moving toward a national health service. Education, public education should be free from childcare and pre-K through regular school to post-secondary, trade schools, college, and continuing adult education. We had CUNY, the City University in New York, was free to New Yorkers from 1848 till 1975. And we're a richer country now, and we're asking, how can we pay for it? Education is expensive, but ignorance is more expensive. So let's provide a good education. And then finally, a secure retirement. The baby boomers, wages have been stagnant since the early 70s. Baby boomers worked, raised their families. The cost of housing and healthcare went through the roof, not to mention if they tried to send their kids to college. So they're retiring without savings. I know people whose Social Security is being garnished for student loans. So what I want to do is double Social Security. That's been on the table for about 10 years. A guy named Stephen Hill out there in California, wrote some articles for The Atlantic and some other places. And I think that's what we need. And then beyond that, Bernie Sanders had a keep our Pension Promises Act back. He introduced it in 2015. In his current platform, he says he wants to reintroduce it. And that would close a couple wealthy people's tax loopholes to put money into the multi-employer pension funds, a lot of which have been cut thanks to a bill they passed in 2014 attached to the omnibus spending bill, passed in the dead of night. And as a result of that, this is my conflict of interest or full disclosure, my Teamsters pension was cut 20% because of that bill. So there's about 10 million of us who have been impacted by that. It's inexcusable because we had the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 said our earned benefits could not be cut. And we worked our whole lives with that promise. And as soon as I retired, they took it from us.
Yeah.
So you want to know why I'm not a Democrat?
Yeah.
They started a war and drafted me when I went into adulthood. And then when I left, they cut my pension. So, and I think a lot of people have had those kinds of experiences.
All right, I got a couple more areas of your platform that I want to talk about in the time that we have left, and that is community control of the police. You have a whole section on your website about that, and that is something a group that I am involved with here in Los Angeles is working on. Tell us what that looks like and why that's so important to you.
Well, this is the man that I watched come forward from the Black Panther Party when I was coming up in the San Francisco Bay Area, 1970. And they actually got it on a ballot in Berkeley, and I think they voted in 71. And I can remember on KQED, the public television station, Ron Dillon's arguing for it as the new congressman from that district. And it did get defeated, but the Panthers had a big conference in 1973. But what the governments did, instead of community control of the police, which means you have elected review boards at the neighborhood level, and you have elected police commission rather than a mayoral appointed police chief to govern the whole system, and the sanctioning and discipline of officers who do police brutality is independent of the police department. Now it's mostly internal affairs that does it. So that's a different system, and that is so needed because we've had, the crime rate has declined for 30 years steadily, but the rate of police killings of Americans, it's about 1,000 a year. And I know people that have been killed by the police from Syracuse. You maybe remember Johnny Gamage back in the mid-90s. His cousin was Ray Seals, a defensive tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Johnny was out there with him. Johnny got suffocated in the suburbs. And actually one of Johnny's cousins is a leader of Black Lives Matter here in Syracuse. She's a Green Party member. And there are other members of that family. There's Darren Seals, one of the activists who knew Michael Brown in Ferguson, is also a cousin of this woman, Rosie Seals, here in Syracuse. And he's one of those guys that was, shot up in his car burn in a murder hasn't been solved. I know I was talking with a woman in California whose son was killed by the police in San Jose, and they say it was a suicide. She witnessed it. So these things, we need real solutions to this. And the review boards that were set up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they haven't got it done. Mostly they're advisory, and the police should work for us. They should serve and protect. Right now we have police forces that tend to do what they did in Iraq. A lot of these guys are veterans, they go into homes and, look for suspects, and they're an occupying force. They should be peacekeepers. It's a whole different job. I think the Greens and, under Mayor Gail McLaughlin had a much better model of policing in Richmond, California, where they provided services to the young guys that were most likely to do the shootings. And the officers had to walk a beat, and they were promoted on the basis of relationships built and problems solved, not tickets written and arrests made. And it led to a big turnover, but they went from 20% to 60% people of color. What was it? 41 of the 44 lieutenants and captains were appointed by Chris Magnuson, who was the chief of police that brought this program in. And the murder rate went from over 40 to 7 over the 8-year period that they had that program.
Yeah, I had Steve Early on my show. Well, actually, I did a book talk for him here in my house, and
Yes.
We did an interview, and he has a whole chapter in his book, Refinery Town, about that. It's really quite remarkable. Where do you stand on prison abolition and also reparations?
Most people in prison should not be there. There are a lot of old political prisoners, Black Panthers who are elderly now. And even if they did some things, they've served their time and they are no threat to society. Just on humanitarian grounds, they should be released. All the people that have nonviolent drug offenses, drug abuse and use is not a criminal problem, it's a healthcare problem. So a lot of people should be released. I'm not for total abolition because there's some dangerous people, that need to be separated. I've seen them on the streets of Syracuse. But we incarcerate more people than any country in the world. And we call ourselves a free country and complain about authoritarian governments that are authoritarian, but what does that say about us? Reparations, I'm for the HR 40, the bill to set up a commission to study reparations that John Conyers introduced many years ago and is now carried by Sheila Jackson Lee as the prime sponsor. She's from Texas. And I think that's the next step on reparations because we need to hear from the African-American community. What do they want from reparations? How much should be individual reparations? The wealth of African-Americans is about 1/10 of white wealth. How much should go to families, but also how much should be collective reparations? Go to Black colleges or community institutions. When James Foreman, coming out of SNCC, brought the Black Manifesto demand for reparations to the Riverside Church back in the late 60s, he wanted collective reparations. He wanted Black-owned media and colleges and those kinds of things. So there's a whole discussion that has to happen there. But the other thing I'll say about it, it isn't just for slavery, it's about segregation and discrimination going on right down to this day. Because what happened after the financial crisis in 2008 is Black America lost half its wealth. The banks stole their homes. Wilbur Ross, Commerce Secretary, ran those service mortgaging companies. That's where the robo-signing was done. That was computerized fraud that stole people's homes. We need reparations for that, or those people's homes, not just Black people, although they were targeted, but a lot of people.
You got me going here. You should start to have some virtual rallies. You ought to take advantage of this time and do a stump speech like Bernie and talk about all this stuff, because seriously, you've got a fan in me now. I want to talk about one final area before I get to the thing that I've been teasing this show with for a week now. And that final area is foreign policy. What do you see the US's role in the world to be? And there was some rift between you and Jill Stein regarding the role that Russia played in our elections, and you were accused of sort of promoting the Russiagate theory. What is your view of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Cuba?
The US should be the world's humanitarian superpower, not a global military empire, which just causes more problems than it supposedly solves. And really, it's there to protect the investments of global corporations based in the United States. So I'm calling for a 75% cut in military spending, the graduated progressive withdrawal of US troops from over 800 foreign military bases, and have a home-based defense. Defend our territory militarily. That's what we should protect. And then I think the biggest issue in foreign policy we face is this new nuclear arms race. We have got out of 4 major nuclear treaties, the most recent being the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. The Strategic Arms Treaty expires February next year. Putin and Trump aren't negotiating that. That's the last bilateral agreement on nuclear arms control between the US and Russia. Both countries now have this crackpot idea that they can escalate, the quote is escalate to de-escalate, use tactical nukes to de-escalate. When in fact, you start using tactical nukes, it's gonna escalate to strategic nukes and it's over. So 2 years ago, 122 nations agreed to the text of a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. And people around the world know that, but Americans don't. Because our commercial media, I've never seen a story, and I watch my fair share of cable news and network news. And they don't know about it. And then none of the major party candidates have talked about it, with the honorable exception of Mike Gravel when he was in the race. He brought it up. It was in his platform. But he's been out of the race. So I think if for no other reason, the Green Party, and not just our presidential candidate, our congressional candidates, even our local candidates should be bringing this issue into the public debate. Because as you probably know, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists just moved their doomsday clock closer to midnight than it's ever been, 100 seconds. And that's because of the climate crisis, the nuclear arms race, and then also they said information warfare, which gets to the Russia question. I don't think Jill and I disagree on what our approach to Russia should be. Whatever the Russians did in 2016 does not justify the US escalating this new Cold War. We've had major war games operation, a 5-month-long war games operation right on Russia's border that was completed last year. The next war games major operation is going to be a nuclear war operation or war game with Russia again as the target. We push NATO up into their face. This is not building peace. This is provoking a country that really doesn't threaten us. You know, their economy is 1/6 of ours. Their military budget is 1/10 of ours, but they are a nuclear superpower. And it's just, you know, it's dangerous to provoke them. Now, I do think the Russians were messing with us, and we mess with those countries. That's what intelligence agencies do. And, you know, we can talk about the details of that. I think that's maybe where Jill and I have a different view. But that doesn't justify the new Cold War, and it doesn't excuse Hillary Clinton for losing the election. You know, whatever the Russians did, she lost that because of Black voter suppression. She lost that because Comey went into her emails again a week before the election, and she ran a terrible campaign. I mean, I know a lot. I'm a retired Teamster, but I was working then, and a lot of the Teamsters voted for Trump because they couldn't stand Hillary because she just seemed like the boss to them. She was associated with Wall Street. She just had a style that was kind of, you know, professional, upper middle class, and looking down at them. That's the way they perceived her. And she didn't get over that, you know, and she didn't use surrogates. She didn't have a program for working people. Trump promised a lot of stuff. It was all lies. But, you know, their attitude was, well, let's shake things up and maybe he'll do something. But they just weren't going to vote for Clinton.
Your focus on this nuclear danger is much more, I've never heard Bernie talk about it, and I'm seriously concerned about it. I had Daniel Ellsberg on my show, and he's really concerned about it too. Just want to, because we're going over here, so I just want to kind of close with the pièce de résistance of this show. So Jill Stein made an offer to Bernie 4 years ago when she saw the Democratic Party cheat him out of the nomination. Well, we see it happening again. Is there anything you want to say to Bernie right now? Just pretend you're talking to him directly.
Well, okay, sure. Bernie, we've known each other since the 70s. I dropped leaflets for you in 2 campaigns in 1972. I organized a showing of your slideshow on Eugene Debs later in the 70s, and so on. So, you know, I would say to you, if you want to break with the Democrats and come to the Green Party, we should have a discussion. And I think your people, your supporters, and you want Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, tuition-free college. And the only way we're going to be able to fight for those things the rest of this year is if you run, or, you know, I'm going to carry forward those things, but Joe Biden certainly isn't. You know what he did to you in the last debate? He said they had single payer in Italy, and look what happened there. You know, he also could have talked about, or you could have talked about, South Korea and Taiwan, which have single payer systems. And they've done a much better job of handling this coronavirus crisis. So, that, you know, the offer is open. I know you're good on your word, and you said you would support any Democrat, and I'm afraid that's probably what you're going to do. But if you change your mind, I would love to talk to you.
Now, I have tried to talk to Bernie too about running independent. I've met him 5 times, but the first time I met him was in April of 2011. And I was like the first one to ask a question. And I said, will you please challenge Obama in the 2012 primary? And I'll never forget how he answered. He said, no. And the way he said it like that made me so clear that he was not going to challenge an incumbent president. 2014, I went up, again because of Steve Early, I went up to Richmond. He was there doing a fundraiser for the Progressive Alliance. And I went up there and I asked him if he would consider running as an independent. And that way he could run a movement and not just a campaign. And he said, I have heard that from other people. I will consider it. So when he didn't, I kind of understood his reasons, because he wanted to get into the debates. He wanted to be taken seriously by the media. The irony was they only had 6 debates. They scheduled him on Saturday or opposite some football game. He was not taken seriously by the media, but he still was able to start a movement. And then the second time I asked him was the day before the California primary. He came to Los Angeles headquarters. I also had printed out an article that Kevin Zeese wrote about how it wasn't Ralph Nader that caused Al Gore's loss, because we had heard that Bernie blamed Nader for Gore's loss and hadn't spoken to him since 2000, when in fact only about 46,000 Democrats voted for Nader, but something like 256,000 Democrats voted for Bush. So why weren't the Democrats blamed for voting for Bush? Why is it always the third party candidate, and the third party voters that have to be shamed for voting for somebody who they want? But anyway, Kevin had written this article debunking it. I was able to give it to Karina Driscoll, his daughter-in-law, and then tell her independents were a plurality now, and that he could probably win if he ran, with Jill. Because we were starting to hear rumors like Comey was going to indict Hillary, but he was going to wait till after the nomination was sewed up so that Bernie couldn't win and they could put in someone like Warren or Biden. So I practiced what I was going to say because I knew I would only have 10 seconds. And as he was walking by, shaking hands, I whispered in his ear, someone took a picture, and I said, Bernie, if they try to cheat you and put in Warren or Biden, run with Jill, you can win. And that's what I said, and all he could do was sort of nod and move along. But he's not going to do it.
The odds are very small he would do that, because I think what he's looking at is he's got 4 more years on his senatorial term. He does want to get Medicare for all. He don't want to burn all his bridges. So I'm afraid he's probably going to, back Biden. And, I can understand Trump is just a sociopathic incompetent. I mean, he's the worst president you could imagine. But we need real solutions. We're running out of time on the climate. Inequality kills. The life expectancy gap between our richest and poorest counties is now 20 years. Life expectancies for working class people have been declining. So that's a life and death issue for a lot of people. And then we talked about the nuclear arms race. We just can't, wait 4 more years before we raise these issues again.
Well, I just want to say one thing to Bernie, and that is this. I understand that you didn't want to do that last time because you didn't want to hand Trump the election, but Trump won anyway. My thinking is that by the time November comes along, we are going to be in a depression, the likes of which this country has never seen. And this is going to make it impossible for Trump to be reelected. So if you're still in the race running as a Green, and it's between you and Joe Biden, who are the people going to pick? So I say, Bernie, go ahead, take Howie's offer, run as a Green. But if not, I think most of us are going to vote for Howie.
I think your projection of what might be the situation in November is a real possibility. I mean, this coronavirus crisis and the economics that go with it just changes everything.
Strange times for all of us, but I think we can keep connected, at least if Facebook doesn't start censoring all the voices on the left. We can keep connected, we can keep organizing, and we can keep fighting. Thank you so much, Howie.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Good night, everybody.